The maid's daughter leaves the mansion every night at dawn, carrying a backpack. The millionaire, suspicious, believes the poor girl is stealing from him. One night, determined to catch her and call the police, he decides to follow the child through the dark streets of the city. After walking for miles to a run-down neighborhood, he approaches a fragile shack and peeks through the window. What he sees on the other side makes the coldest and most powerful man in the city break down in tears. The silence in Arthur Sterling's mansion was a palpable entity, an expensive luxury he cultivated with the same zeal he applied to managing his vast estate. At 50, Arthur had spun a small inheritance into a monumental fortune, moving through the stock market with a surgeon's precision and a general's cold detachment. His life was a fortress of rules and routines, designed to maximize efficiency and minimize unnecessary human contact. His employees were like pieces on a chessboard, functional, replaceable, and kept at a calculated distance. He knew them not by their names, but by their functions. To him, they were assets that kept the gears of his business and personal life turning, and any deviation from the expected was treated as a liability to be eliminated. 2 months ago, a new piece had been added to this board. Helena, a woman with a tired gaze but nimble hands, was hired as a cleaner. The agency had insisted she was the best, but there was a complication. A 7-year-old daughter, Lena, Helena, cornered by circumstances she didn't bother to explain, had pleaded for the girl to be allowed to live with her in the staff quarters. Arthur loathed complications. Children were synonymous with noise, disorder, and unpredictability, elements he abhorred. Yet, something in Helena's dignified posture and quiet desperation made him concede. Against his better judgment, he imposed a draconian rule. The girl was to be invisible and inaudible, a ghost in his own home. For the first few weeks, the condition was met. Lena was a shadow, a fleeting glimpse in the hallways, always with her head down. Arthur barely registered her presence, but the self-imposed tranquility began to crumble in subtle ways. First, it was a feeling, a disturbance in the emotional cash flow of his home. Then, it became a concrete observation. Arthur suffered from insomnia, a byproduct of a mind that never stopped calculating profits and risks. During his nightly walks through the mansion, he would spend hours in the security room, a sanctuary of screens displaying every corner of his property. It was a habit, a way to ensure his assets were secure, and it was there, in the bluish glow of the monitors, that he first saw it. It was 3:15 a.m. The camera in the back corridor, leading to a rarely used service door, captured movement. A tiny figure, wrapped in a coat far too large for her, moved with the stealth of a feral animal. It was Lena. She carried a small backpack, the weight causing her to stoop slightly. With a skill that would surprise any adult, she unlocked the door without the slightest sound and disappeared into the darkness of the garden. A chill ran down Arthur's spine, a sensation that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. This was an anomaly, an unacceptable breach in his perfectly controlled system. He rewound the footage, watching the scene again and again. There was no doubt, the girl was sneaking out. A wave of icy irritation washed over him. His first conclusion was logical, based on years of instinctual distrust. He was being played. The mother and daughter were accomplices in some sordid scheme. But what kind of scheme involved a 7-year-old child leaving alone in the middle of the night? The question hung in the air. Laden with dark possibilities, his pragmatic mind refused to fully explore. He stood up, his knuckles white as he leaned on the control desk. His sanctuary of order had been violated, and the image of that small figure vanishing into the night was seared into his mind. A dangerous enigma he had to solve before his meticulously constructed world began to fall apart. What was that child doing? And where was she going, night after night, without anyone knowing? The next morning, the sun, streaming through the panoramic windows of the dining room, seemed to mock the darkness that had settled in Arthur's mind. The outside world remained the same, but his inner universe had been irrevocably altered. He watched Helena serve his coffee with predatory attention. Every one of her movements, previously ignored, was now scrutinized under a lens of suspicion. The weariness in her eyes, which he once would have interpreted as the result of hard work, now looked like the weight of complicity. And Lena, sitting quietly at the small table in the kitchen, visible through the ajar service door, was no longer an invisible child. She was a co-conspirator, a little thief whose downcast eyes hid unspeakable secrets. Arthur's moral rigidity, the same that guided his business and investments, allowed for no nuance. To him, a lie was a lie, a theft was a theft, regardless of the scale. In the days that followed, the mansion transformed into an observation field. Arthur became a ghost in his own house, moving silently, his senses sharpened for any anomaly. Every night, he stationed himself in the security room, the glow of the screens reflecting off his thin-rimmed glasses, and every night the same ritual repeated. At 3:15 a.m. precisely, the small figure of Lena would emerge, cross the corridor, and disappear through the back door. The regularity of the act both intrigued and enraged him. This wasn't an impulse, it was a plan. A methodical operation that mocked his authority and his security. He felt the violation on a profound level, as if it weren't just his property at risk, but the very order of his world. His net worth wasn't just measured in dollars or stocks, it was measured in control, and he was losing it within his own walls. Suspicion needed concrete proof, something quantifiable. One night, after Lena had left, Arthur went down to the kitchen. The impeccable organization of the room, maintained by Helena, now seemed like a facade. He opened the refrigerator, his eyes scanning the neat shelves. Nothing seemed out of place. Then he went to the pantry. It was there he noticed the small discrepancies, invisible to a casual glance, but glaring to someone looking for them. A package of cookies with one unit less than it should have, an apple missing from the bowl, a small yogurt he was sure he had seen the day before. Gone. They were trivial items, crumbs from his vast wealth, but to Arthur, the monetary value was irrelevant. What mattered was the breach of trust, the audacity of the theft. The connection in his mind was instant and irrefutable. The backpack the girl carried wasn't empty, she was transporting the stolen goods. Every night, she took a little piece of his house, a piece of his assets, to an unknown destination. The anger he felt was cold and sharp. He considered confronting Helena immediately, firing her, and turning the child over to the authorities. It was the standard procedure, the logical response to a liability compromising the security of his business and his life. Yet, a part of him, a dark and nagging curiosity, held him back. Firing them would be easy, but it wouldn't answer the central question that haunted him. Where was she going? What would a 7-year-old child do with stolen food in the middle of the night? He had to know. The security camera footage was no longer enough. He needed to see it with his own eyes, to witness the final act of this betrayal. The decision crystallized in his mind, hard and unyielding as a diamond. He would no longer be a spectator. The next night, he would follow the little thief and uncover the truth, whatever the cost. Arthur's determination solidified into an icy stillness that permeated the entire mansion the next day. He moved through his domains with his usual precision, but his mind was far from the stock market charts and gold prices flashing in his office. Every shadow seemed longer, every sound sharper. When Helena served him lunch, he watched her over the rim of his crystal glass, searching for a tremor in her hands, a shift in her gaze. But she was the picture of quiet servitude, her face a mask of exhaustion and resignation. Her apparent calm only fueled the fire of Arthur's suspicion. He saw it as a performance, an act worthy of a seasoned actress, and he felt a growing contempt for the woman's audacity. He, a man who had built his empire on the ability to read people and anticipate their moves, was being deceived under his own roof. During the afternoon, a call from his financial advisor, Rick, interrupted his dark thoughts. Rick's voice was energetic, full of numbers and projections. "Arthur, the crypto portfolio performed exceptionally this quarter. The profit is substantial. I suggest we reallocate some of those gains into a new high-yield hedge fund." Arthur listened, but the words sounded distant, like the buzz of an insect. Money, fortune, wealth. They were the pillars of his existence, but at that moment they seemed like abstract, irrelevant concepts. "Do what you think is best, Rick," he replied, his voice flat. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Everything okay, Arthur?" "You sound distracted." The observation irritated him. "I'm just handling an internal matter, a security issue," he said, the word security laden with a weight Rick couldn't possibly comprehend. He ended the call abruptly, the contrast between his multi-million-dollar dealings and his obsession with a child with a backpack becoming almost surreal. As evening fell, a grim calm settled over him. It was the calm that precedes the execution of a well-laid plan. He dined alone, as always, the clinking of his silver cutlery on the porcelain plate, the only sound in the vast hall. Afterward, he went to his room and changed out of his impeccable suit into dark clothing and soft-soled shoes. He looked at himself in the mirror and saw a stranger. Not the billionaire who sat on corporate boards, but a hunter preparing for the chase. He felt no excitement, only a somber need to restore order, to expose the fraud and eradicate the problem. He descended the stairs in silence and positioned himself in a small gardening room with a window overlooking the back door. There, in the darkness, he waited. Time crawled. Every creak of the old mansion, every sigh of the wind outside, seemed amplified. He glanced at his watch, 3 o'clock, then 3:10. His heart, usually a reliable metronome, beat a little faster. He was in control. He was always in control. Then at 3:15 a.m. on the dot, he heard it. The almost imperceptible click of the lock, a sound he would never have noticed before. The door opened slowly, a slit of darkness in the greater dark. Lena's silhouette appeared, small and frail against the night. She glanced from side to side, her movements quick and nervous, before slipping out and closing the door with infinite care. Arthur felt the blood run cold in his veins. The precision, the punctuality, it was all real. He waited for her to get a few yards away, his heart hammering against his ribs, and then he opened his own door. The cold pre-dawn air hit his face. He moved into the shadows of the trees, his steps completely silent. Up ahead, the small figure quickened her pace, her backpack bouncing rhythmically. The chase had begun. The early morning air was sharp, a brutal contrast to the climate-controlled atmosphere of his mansion. Arthur maintained a safe distance, moving from shadow to shadow like an urban predator. The streets of his exclusive neighborhood were deserted, the imposing houses steeped in a silent, wealthy slumber. The only lights were the street lamps, which cast long, ghostly shadows on the pavement. Lena, for her part, seemed to know the way by heart. She didn't hesitate at any corner, her small feet moving with an urgency that belied her size. Arthur, accustomed to being driven in his chauffeured luxury sedan, felt the muscles in his legs protest the unaccustomed effort, but adrenaline and anger propelled him forward. Every step that girl took was a confirmation of her betrayal, a direct affront to his trust and generosity. They left the wide, tree-lined streets behind and entered a more commercial area, now dormant. The shop windows reflected their fleeting figures, a dark man stalking a child. The image was disturbing, but Arthur pushed it away. He wasn't the villain here. He was the victim, the guardian of justice who would expose the truth. The journey continued, mile after mile. The air grew heavier, the scent of cut grass replaced by an odor of dampness and neglect. The houses became smaller, packed closer together, their facades peeling and their windows dark like empty eyes. They were entering a part of the city he only knew from real estate depreciation reports, a place his investments would never touch. A place that, to him, shouldn't exist. Poverty offended him. It was a sign of failure, of a lack of discipline and ambition, the very pillars upon which he had built his life and fortune. Lena didn't slow down. She seemed to belong to this desolate landscape. Moving with a familiarity Arthur found repulsive. He felt like an intruder, his expensive coat and Italian shoes an anomaly in this environment. A skinny dog barked from a dark alley, and he flinched, not from fear, but from disgust. The girl, however, didn't even glance over. She turned into a narrow alley, barely lit by a single yellowed bulb that flickered intermittently. The walls were exposed brick, covered in graffiti. The ground was packed dirt, with puddles of still water reflecting the sickly light. Arthur hesitated for a moment. This place was the opposite of everything he knew and valued. It was chaos against his order, decay against his success. But he had come too far to turn back. He followed her down the alley, his heart pounding with a mixture of revulsion and anticipation. The end of the line was near. The alley opened into a small courtyard surrounded by makeshift shacks, flimsy structures of wood, tin and tarpaulin. The smell of mold and misery was overwhelming. Lena stopped before one of the most precarious structures, a hut that looked as if it could collapse with a strong gust of wind. The door was a crooked piece of plywood, and there was no glass in the windows, only ripped plastic. She glanced around one last time, her small body tense, before slipping inside without a sound. Arthur hid behind a pile of rubble, his heart in his throat. This was it, the den, the place where the fruits of her theft were taken. He waited a few minutes, his breath held tight in his chest. What would happen now? Would she hand the food to an adult, an accomplice, a criminal using her for their own ends? Rage simmered inside him, a righteous, purifying fury. He crept closer to the shack, his steps careful on the uneven ground. There was a crack in the wall, near the plastic-covered window. He leaned in, his eye pressed against the rough wood, ready to witness the final proof that would confirm all his worst suspicions. Through the crack in the wood, the interior of the shack revealed itself in fragments. The only source of light was a small candle, its trembling flame dancing on the makeshift walls, casting long, grotesque shadows. The space was tiny, almost claustrophobic. There was no furniture, only a thin, stained mattress thrown directly on the dirt floor. And on the mattress, curled up under a threadbare blanket, was another child. A boy, perhaps a year or two younger than Lena, his face pale and sunken, his eyes closed in a restless sleep. Lena was kneeling beside him, her backpack open on the floor. Arthur saw her take out the yogurt, the cookies, and the apple. The very items he'd noted were missing. His anger intensified, a wave of heat that made him clench his fists. There was the proof, the thief and her accomplice. He prepared to pull away, to take out his phone and call the police. This was the end of the line, the checkmate. But then he saw something that made him freeze, something that didn't fit his narrative of crime and deceit. Lena didn't eat the food. Instead, she touched the boy's shoulder with infinite gentleness. "Peter," she whispered, her voice a nearly inaudible thread. "Peter, wake up. I brought food." The boy stirred, a faint moan escaping his lips. He opened his eyes, and even in the dim light, Arthur could see they were clouded, feverish. He coughed, a dry, painful sound that echoed in the shack's silence. Lena opened the yogurt container and, with a plastic spoon she took from her pocket, began to feed her brother. She did it with a heart-wrenching patience and care, blowing on each spoonful, whispering words of encouragement. "Just a little more. You need to get strong." Arthur's brain struggled to process the scene. The cold, hard certainty that had guided him here began to crack, to crumble at the edges. This wasn't a den of thieves. It was a sanctuary of desperation. The rage he felt began to morph into something more complex, more uncomfortable: confusion. He watched the girl break the apple with her small hands and give the pieces to her brother, who barely had the strength to chew. She didn't touch a single bite. Her eyes, large and dark in the candlelight, were fixed on the boy, a mixture of love, fear, and a fierce determination that seemed too big for such a small body. Arthur noticed that Lena's hands were trembling slightly. She was scared, not scared of being caught, but scared for her brother. He continued to watch, paralyzed, as Lena wiped the boy's face with the sleeve of her own coat. The boy coughed again, harder this time, a fit that made him double over in pain. Lena wrapped her arms around him, her tiny body trying to shield his. "It's going to be okay, Peter. It's going to be okay," she murmured, more to herself than to him. And then the tears began to roll silently down her face. She didn't sob, didn't make a sound. She just wept, the tears falling onto her brother's hair. They were the tears of a miniature mother, a guardian burdened with a weight no adult should have to bear, let alone a child. The scene hit Arthur with the force of a punch to the gut. His certainties, his moral rigidity, his black and white worldview, it all turned to dust before that image of suffering and sacrificial love. The billionaire, the master of the financial universe, the man who prided himself on his calculated coldness, felt something inside him break. The wall of ice around his heart didn't crack, it shattered. He fell back from the window, stumbling backward, the breath knocked out of him. He hadn't seen a thief, he had seen a hero. And the realization of his error in judgment was so overwhelming, so complete, that it left him gasping for air. Arthur walked away from the shack like a sleepwalker, his feet tripping on the uneven dirt. The journey back home was a trek through a fog of confusion and shame. The streets that had once seemed hostile and decayed now looked different, tinged by the tragedy he had just witnessed. Each dark house, each broken window was no longer a symbol of failure, but a potential shelter for countless stories of quiet desperation. Like Lena and Peter's, his mind, accustomed to processing data and calculating probabilities, was short-circuiting. There was no spreadsheet or chart that could quantify what he had felt seeing that little girl's tears. The coldness that had always been his shield, his greatest defense against the world's emotional complications, had melted away, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. He reached the mansion as the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky gray. The house, once a symbol of his order and power, now seemed hollow and cavernously large. The silence he had so valued now sounded like loneliness. He entered through the same back door Lena had used hours before, feeling like an intruder in his own home. He went up to his room and stood before the mirror, but he didn't recognize himself. The man staring back had haunted eyes, his face etched with an emotion he hadn't felt in decades: guilt. He, Arthur Sterling, a man whose net worth was greater than the GDP of some small countries, had almost called the police on a 7-year-old girl for stealing a yogurt to feed her dying brother. The monstrosity of his rushed judgment hit him with physical force, making him sit on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands. When Helena appeared for the morning routine, Arthur watched her with new eyes. The exhaustion on her face was no longer a sign of complicity, but of an invisible, draining struggle. He noticed the deep circles under her eyes, the way her shoulders were hunched under an invisible weight. How could she not know? The question echoed in his mind. Was it possible that Lena was doing all of this alone, carrying that burden in secret to protect her mother? The idea was almost inconceivable, but after what he'd seen, nothing seemed impossible anymore. He remembered Helena's plea to bring her daughter, her desperation to take the job. She wasn't trying to deceive him, she was desperate. And he, in his arrogance, had interpreted her desperation as dishonesty. The image of little Peter, weak and feverish on the filthy mattress, haunted his thoughts. The boy was clearly sick, perhaps gravely so. And Lena, the courage of that girl, her determination, it was something he, with all his resources and power, had never encountered in his life. She wasn't just stealing food. She was fighting for her brother's life in the only way she knew how. And then, amid his self-loathing, a new phrase he had overheard through the crack in the shack came back to him, cutting through the noise in his thoughts. "Hang on. The medicine will be here soon." He had been so focused on the scene with the food that he had barely registered the words. Now, they returned with terrifying significance. Medicine. What medicine? Where would a 7-year-old girl get medicine? The food was only part of the story. There was something more, something he hadn't understood. The complexity of the situation was far greater than he had imagined. This wasn't just about poverty and hunger, it was about life, and he refused to complete the thought. The revelation that Lena's fight was even more desperate than he had realized filled him with a cold dread. He was no longer just ashamed, he was terrified of what might happen if he did nothing. The day dragged on in a silent torture for Arthur. He tried to focus on his work, on the fluctuations of the Dow Jones, on the exchange rates of euros and dollars, but it all seemed meaningless. The columns of numbers on his high-definition screens blurred into the bars of a prison he had built around his own heart. Every investment decision, every cash flow analysis, felt like a sham in the face of the raw reality he had witnessed. His wealth, once the measure of his success and power, now seemed like a grotesque burden, a mountain of useless resources, while a child fought for crumbs and medicine just a few miles away. Lena's phrase, "The medicine will be here soon," echoed in his head like a fire alarm. What did she mean by it? Was she trying to buy prescriptions with money she didn't have? Or was she involved in something even more dangerous? The vulnerability of those children terrified him. He knew he could no longer be a passive observer. Guilt was gnawing at him, but guilt alone would change nothing. He needed to act. But how? Confronting Helena seemed the logical step, but he feared her reaction. The fear in her eyes was a barrier. If she was hiding the existence of her sick son, she had a powerful reason. The terror of losing her job, the only livelihood that guaranteed a roof, however precarious, for her family. If he confronted her, he could trigger the very catastrophe she feared. On the other hand, approaching Lena directly felt equally wrong. It would frighten the girl, break the trust she, somehow, placed in the silence of that house. He felt trapped, powerless, a sensation utterly foreign to him. Arthur Sterling, the man who moved capital and influenced markets, didn't know how to have a simple conversation. The solution, when it came, was as quiet as Lena herself. That afternoon, as he passed the hallway leading to the kitchen, he saw the girl sitting on a small stool, drawing on a piece of paper with a pencil stub. It was the first time he had seen her in a moment of apparent calm. Helena was nowhere in sight. Moved by an impulse he didn't understand, Arthur stopped. He cleared his throat. The sound jarringly loud in the quiet corridor. Lena flinched, instinctively hiding her drawing, her eyes wide with fear. Her reaction was a knife to his chest. He was the monster in this house. "Is that a nice drawing?" he managed to say, his voice hoarse and awkward. She didn't answer, just stared at him, ready to bolt. He tried again, his voice softer. "I'm not going to hurt you. I wanted to know if you're okay." The question hung in the air, weighted with a meaning only the two of them understood. Lena's eyes filled with a deep suspicion, but also a flicker of curiosity. She looked at him, at the man who represented all the power and authority in her small world. And perhaps she saw something different in his eyes at that moment, a crack in his icy facade. She hesitated, her lower lip trembling, and then, in a voice so quiet he had to lean in to hear, she whispered, "My brother is sick." It was a simple, direct confession. devoid of any plea, a plain statement of a fact that ruled her life. At that exact moment, Helena appeared at the kitchen doorway, her face pale with exhaustion. She froze at the sight, her daughter talking to the master of the house. Panic seized her features. She rushed forward, pulling Lena behind her like a lioness protecting her cub. "Lena, what did I tell you about bothering Mr. Sterling?" Her voice was a mix of fear and anger. "I apologize. Sir, she won't bother you again." But Arthur barely heard her. Lena's confession, spoken with such devastating innocence, had broken the last of his barriers. The turning point wasn't a thunderous event, but a whisper. And in that moment, Arthur knew that his involvement was no longer a choice. It was an obligation. The air in the kitchen grew heavy, charged with Helena's panic and Lena's confusion. Arthur, however, felt an unexpected clarity. The girl's whisper had given him the permission he didn't know he needed. He looked at Helena, whose face was a mask of terror, and spoke with a calm that surprised even himself. "She wasn't bothering me, Helena. I asked if she was okay." His words, rather than calming her, seemed to deepen the woman's fear. She gripped Lena's arm tighter, her knuckles white. "We're fine, sir. Perfectly fine. I'm sorry for the trouble." The denial was so fierce, so desperate. It was almost a confession. She was building a wall around her secret, and he realized any attempt to tear it down by force would only make her dig in deeper. He backed away, a tactical move he'd learned in business, but was now applying to a delicate human situation. "All right, Helena," he said softly, and walked away, leaving the two of them alone with the tension his presence had created. However, the seed of truth had been planted. He now knew, without a doubt, that the mother was aware of her son's illness, and the fear of losing her job was the lock on her secret. He needed to find a key, not a battering ram. He spent the rest of the day in his office, not looking at financial markets, but doing research. He typed vague symptoms into search engines, read about childhood diseases, trying to understand what could be afflicting a young boy to the point of leaving him so weak. The world of medicine was as complex as finance. But here, the liabilities weren't monetary losses, they were lives. The vastness of his own ignorance humbled him. The next day, which was Helena's day off, Arthur put his plan into action. He knew words wouldn't be enough to break her distrust. He needed an action, a gesture that would speak louder than any promise. He went in person to the most expensive grocery store in the city, a place he hadn't set foot in for years. Pushing the cart through the wide, pristine aisles, he felt like an alien. He didn't buy food. Food simply appeared on his table. But that day, he chose each item with meticulous care. Fresh fruits, vegetables, prime cuts of meat, juices, yogurts, and a whole section of children's treats he imagined might bring a flicker of joy to small, serious faces. Afterward, he went to a toy store and, feeling completely lost, bought toy cars, building blocks, and a soft teddy bear. With his car loaded, he drove to the neighborhood that now haunted his dreams. The daylight made the poverty even starker, more exposed. He parked a few blocks away, not wanting his luxury car to look like an invasion. Carrying the heavy bags, he walked down the alley and stopped before the shack. He felt his heart pound. What if they weren't there? What if he was wrong? He took a deep breath and knocked gently on the makeshift door. There was a silence, then the sound of shuffling feet. The door opened a crack and Helena's face appeared, pale and shocked. Her eyes widened when she saw him standing there, holding overflowing grocery bags. She looked at him, then at the bags, confusion and fear warring on her face. She said nothing, just stood there, blocking the entrance, as if her frail presence could stop the world she fought so hard to keep standing from finally collapsing. The silence between them stretched, fragile and tense. Arthur could see over Helena's shoulder into the dark interior of the shack, and he smelled the dampness and sickness that emanated from within. He didn't wait for an invitation. With a gentle but firm push, he opened the door and stepped inside. his large frame seeming to fill the entire tiny space. Helena fell back, a gasp of defeat escaping her lips. On the mattress in the corner, Peter lay, just as Arthur had seen him in the darkness. But the daylight revealed the severity of his condition. His skin had a grayish tone, and his lips were dry and cracked. He looked at Arthur with large, feverish eyes, not comprehending who this stranger was in his small world. Lena, who had been sitting by her brother's side, jumped to her feet, her face a mixture of panic and a spark of hope. Arthur didn't say a word. He simply began unloading the bags onto the dirt floor, creating an island of abundance in the middle of the squalor. The vibrant colors of the fruit, the shiny wrappers of the cookies, the new toys. It all seemed surreal in that setting. Helena watched, paralyzed, as tears streamed silently down her face. They were not tears of gratitude, not yet. They were tears of fear, of shame, of having her deepest, most painful secret exposed so brutally. "Sir, please," she whispered, her voice choked. "I can explain. Don't fire us. I need this job. It's all we have." Her plea, the assumption that his first concern would be his property or his house rules, hit Arthur harder than any accusation. He finally understood the depth of the chasm that separated them. He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. "I'm not here to fire you, Helena," he said, his voice heavy. "I'm here to understand and to help." He picked up the teddy bear and walked toward the mattress. He knelt on the dirty floor, an act that would have been unthinkable for him just a few days ago. He held the bear out to Peter. The boy shrank back, frightened, but his eyes were fixed on the soft toy. Lena, seeing her brother's hesitation, came forward and took the bear from Arthur's hands, placing it gently in Peter's arms. The boy hugged it with what little strength he had, a small, fragile smile touching his lips for the first time. That smile, so small and so significant, was the only reward Arthur needed. Meanwhile, in a glass and steel office downtown, Rick, Arthur's financial advisor, frowned at a series of unusual withdrawals from his boss's personal account. They were small amounts by Arthur's standards, but frequent and in cash. They were anomalies in his client's perfectly predictable cash flow. Rick was an ambitious man whose loyalty was tied more to dividends than to people. Curiosity gnawed at him. He hired a private investigator, a discreet service he used to get a market edge. He wanted to know what was diverting Arthur's attention and resources. Greed was an instinct, and he smelled an opportunity, a vulnerability in his billionaire boss that could be exploited for his own profit. He didn't know what it was, but he was determined to find out, and when he did, he would use that information to grow his own capital, no matter the human cost. The subplot of betrayal and greed began to weave itself, an invisible web that would soon entangle them all. The dam of Helena's fear finally broke under the weight of that inexplicable act of kindness. The tears that were once of dread became a flood of pain held back for months, perhaps years. Seeing Arthur kneeling on the floor of her humble home, offering a toy to her sick son, she fell apart. The story came out in a torrent of broken words, a painful confession that filled the stale air of the shack. She told him about Peter, about the fever that never broke, about the weakness that consumed him day by day. She spoke of sleepless nights, of treks through overcrowded public hospitals, of exhausted doctors who gave her vague diagnoses and ineffective prescriptions. Finally, a young resident, moved by her desperation, had dug deeper. The diagnosis came like a death sentence, a rare, degenerative genetic disorder that attacked the muscles and internal organs. "He told me there was a treatment," Helena continued, her voice a hoarse whisper. "But it's new, experimental, only available at a private clinic." He wrote the name on a piece of paper. I didn't even have the courage to ask the price. I knew it would be like trying to buy the moon. She had hidden Peter's existence out of sheer panic. Who would hire a cleaner whose life was dictated by a child's medical emergencies? The fear of losing the only roof she could offer Lena, the only job that let her buy the food her daughter secretly carried away, was greater than anything else. She lived in a state of denial and terror, praying for a miracle while watching her son waste away. Arthur listened to every word, the world of business, stocks, and hedge funds seeming like a distant galaxy. His entire life had been devoted to building and protecting his fortune, to analyzing assets and liabilities. And now, before him, was the most terrible liability he had ever encountered. A child's life slipping away for lack of money. His immense wealth, his net worth that placed him among the richest men in the country, suddenly seemed to have a purpose, a responsibility he had never considered. This wasn't about charity or philanthropy. It was about humanity. It was about the fact that he had the means to buy the moon, and a child desperately needed him to do it. He looked at Peter, now dozing with the teddy bear in his arms, and at Lena, who watched him with an intensity that disarmed him. In her, he saw not just a brave little girl, but the reflection of a fundamental injustice that all his capital could not justify. As Arthur's transformation deepened in that shack, miles away, Rick examined a manila envelope on his mahogany desk. The investigator's report was succinct, but the accompanying photographs were explosive. Arthur Sterling, the reclusive, cold-hearted billionaire, kneeling in the dirt, surrounded by a destitute family. The images were a potential scandal, a powerful weapon. Rick smiled. A thin, predatory smile. He didn't see an act of compassion. He saw a weakness, an emotional deviation that could be exploited, a vulnerability that was worth its weight in gold. Arthur's involvement with this family was an anomaly that threatened his public image and the stability of his businesses, and Rick knew exactly how to use that threat to his own advantage. Arthur stood up, his decision made. The doubt and shame had been replaced by a steely determination. "What's the name of the disease, Helena?" he asked. She told him, the complicated name sounding alien on her lips. He committed it to memory. "Pack a few things for you and the children. You're not staying here anymore." He turned and left the shack, leaving behind a stunned mother and 2 children who couldn't comprehend what had just happened. As soon as he was inside his car, his sanctuary of leather and silence, he picked up the phone. He didn't call a broker or a bank manager. He called his personal physician. "Nee, I'm sending you the name of a rare medical condition," Arthur said, his voice firm and unwavering. "I want you to find the best specialists in the world, the most advanced treatments, everything that exists. And don't worry about the cost. It's irrelevant." The transition from the squalor of the shack to the sterile luxury of the mansion was a cultural and emotional shock for Helena and her children. Arthur installed them in a rarely used guest wing, with spacious rooms, soft beds, and bathrooms larger than the entire home they had left behind. Lena explored everything with wide-eyed wonder and intimidation, while Peter, too weak to move, watched the high ceiling of his new room, the teddy bear still clutched tightly. For Helena, every comfort was a stab of anxiety. She felt like an imposter, an intruder in a world that wasn't hers, constantly waiting for the dream to turn into a nightmare, and for them to be cast back into the darkness. Arthur's generosity was so overwhelming it felt suspicious, a high-risk investment whose return she couldn't calculate. Arthur, for his part, threw himself into the battle for Peter's health with the same intensity he would dedicate to a hostile takeover. The news from his doctor was a blow. The treatment existed, yes, and it was promising. But it was available in only one place, the Valerius Clinic, an elite medical center known for its exclusivity and astronomical costs. And, to complicate matters further, the clinic was controlled by a healthcare conglomerate in which, ironically, his advisor Rick had recently persuaded him to make a significant investment. Arthur felt a chill, an unpleasant coincidence, but he dismissed it, focused on the main goal, getting Peter a place. That's when the obstacles began to appear, subtle and inexplicable. Peter's admission to the clinic was delayed due to bureaucratic issues. Medical records were lost. Arthur's calls to the clinic's administration went unreturned. Every door he tried to open was gently closed in his face. He, who was accustomed to the world bending to his command, was met with a passive, frustrating resistance. At the same time, the pressure from his own family began. His sister, a socialite concerned only with appearances, called in a fury. "Arthur, what is going on? There are rumors you're sheltering street people. This is a disaster for our family name. You know how these people are, always trying to take advantage. Get rid of them before this turns into a scandal." Her words, so full of contempt, only strengthened his resolve. What Arthur didn't know was that the sabotage wasn't bureaucratic, but personal. Rick, upon discovering the name of the clinic, saw his golden opportunity. He used his influence as an investor to secretly block Peter's access. His plan was simple and cruel. Let Arthur despair. Watch him fail in his charitable crusade. Then, at the moment of greatest desperation, he would swoop in as the savior, fixing the problem, and, in return, demanding a larger stake in Arthur's businesses, perhaps even control of certain assets. He was using a child's life as leverage in a power negotiation. With each passing day, Peter's condition worsened, and Arthur's frustration morphed into a cold desperation. He was at war, but he couldn't see his enemy's face. It was Helena who, unintentionally, gave him the clue he needed. One evening, as Arthur stared helplessly at the unanswered emails from the clinic, she approached, bringing him a cup of tea. "Sir," she said, hesitating, "that man who was here earlier, your advisor, I didn't like the way he looked at us. It was cold, like we were numbers on a page." Arthur froze. He remembered Rick's unexpected visit that afternoon, under the pretext of discussing an investment fund. He remembered the look in Rick's eyes, a calculating gleam he had always interpreted as business acumen, but now, filtered through Helena's words, he saw that look in a new light. It wasn't acumen, it was appraisal. He had been appraising the value of this complication in his life. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with a terrible, deafening certainty. The enemy wasn't in the clinic's bureaucracy. It was inside his own circle of trust. The revelation hit Arthur with the force of a physical betrayal. Rick, the person he entrusted with the management of his vast fortune, the man who knew every detail of his estate, was actively sabotaging an innocent child's chance at life for pure financial gain. The calculated coldness Arthur had once admired in his advisor now revealed itself in its most monstrous form. The anger he felt was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Not the icy irritation of a broken rule, but a white-hot, primal fury born of the deepest injustice. The game board had changed dramatically. This was no longer a battle against a disease or an indifferent healthcare system. It was a direct confrontation with greed personified. He spent the night awake, not in despair, but in strategy. He gathered all communications with the clinic, every email from Rick, every investment report. By morning, he was a general preparing for the final battle. He called an emergency meeting of the healthcare conglomerate's board, using his position as a major investor to force the summons. Rick would be there too, as his representative. It would be the perfect stage for the showdown. Before he left, he went to see Peter. The boy was paler, his breathing more shallow. Time was running out. Lena sat by her brother's bed, holding his hand, her small, serious face etched with a worry no child should ever know. Looking at them solidified Arthur's resolve. He wasn't just fighting for one child, he was fighting for the soul of everything he had built. The boardroom was a cold, impersonal space, dominated by a long, polished mahogany table. The board members, powerful men and women accustomed to discussing profits and dividends, regarded Arthur with curiosity. Rick sat beside him, a confident smile on his face, believing the meeting had been called to discuss a new financial venture. Arthur let the initial formalities play out, his silence heightening the tension. Then, when it was his turn to speak, he rose. His voice was calm, but it carried a weight that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. "I didn't call you here today to discuss cash flow or stock performance," he began, his gaze locked on Rick. "I called you here to discuss the integrity of this organization." He then methodically laid out Peter's situation, without naming names, describing the rare disease and the Valerius Clinic's inexplicable refusal to admit him. He presented the documents, the emails, the frustrated attempts at contact. A murmur went through the room. Then he delivered the final blow. "I have discovered that this obstruction is not a bureaucratic failure. It is a deliberate act of sabotage, orchestrated by someone in this room who is using a child's life as leverage for personal gain." All eyes turned to Rick, whose smile had vanished, replaced by a mask of pale shock. "Arthur, that's absurd," he stammered, trying to regain his composure. "What proof do you have?" Arthur looked directly at him, the coldness in his gaze like broken glass. "I have proof of your communications with the clinic's director, pressing them to indefinitely postpone the admission of an unnamed patient, perfectly coinciding with the dates I was trying to have the boy admitted." He threw a folder onto the table. "And I have the testimony of a director at the clinic who, when faced with the possibility of a public scandal, decided his conscience was worth more than his loyalty to you." The silence in the room was absolute. Rick was exposed, disarmed. The moment of truth had arrived, and Arthur's choice was clear. He could destroy Rick, risking a collapse in his own investments and facing a legal battle that could tarnish his name forever, or he could back down, save his fortune, and condemn Peter. It was the climax of his journey, the point where the dollar value of his life collided with the incalculable value of a human one. For a long moment, Arthur remained standing, the boardroom's silence pressing down on him. He could feel the calculating gazes of the board members, assessing not the morality of the situation, but the financial impact of the imminent scandal. In his mind, he saw two roads diverge. One was safe, paved with the cold logic of business, a quiet settlement, the discreet removal of Rick, the protection of his assets at all costs. The other was a dirt track, uncertain and perilous, that could lead to the loss of a significant part of his fortune, lawsuits, and the kind of public exposure he had always shunned. But at the end of that road, he saw Peter's face, breathing easier, and Lena's eyes, finally free from the burden of worry. The choice, which should have been the most difficult of his life, became the simplest. "There will be no settlement," Arthur said, his voice resonating with an unshakable authority that surprised everyone, including himself. "I demand Mr. Rick's immediate resignation from all boards connected to my estate and a full investigation into his practices. Furthermore, I demand Peter's immediate admission to the Valerius Clinic, with all costs covered indefinitely by this conglomerate's charitable foundation, as a gesture of atonement for the unethical conduct of one of its associates." It was an ultimatum, a high-stakes gamble. He was betting a considerable portion of his assets on the decency of these people. Ricky, white as a sheet, tried to protest, but the looks of contempt from the other board members silenced him. The fear of public scandal was a more powerful weapon than any loyalty. The chairman of the board, an older man with shrewd eyes, cleared his throat. "Your terms are drastic, Mr. Sterling, but under the circumstances, they are understandable. Consider them met." The first victory was won, but the cost was immediate. In the days that followed, Rick's departure sent shockwaves through his investment circles. Arthur had to hastily sell off a large portfolio of stocks to cover losses from his former advisor's mismanagement and fraud, which turned out to be deeper than he'd imagined. He faced lawsuits from other investors Rick had deceived. His sister stopped speaking to him, deeming his actions a disgrace to the family name. He lost money, he lost friends, and he lost the armor of invulnerability he had spent a lifetime building. But for every dollar he lost, he felt strangely lighter, as if shedding a weight he never knew he carried. The second, more important victory came a week later. Peter was admitted to the Valerius Clinic. The treatment began immediately. Arthur accompanied Helena to the hospital on the first day. He saw the team of doctors and nurses surrounding the boy with care and cutting-edge technology. He saw hope, fragile but real, return to Helena's eyes. He saw Lena, sitting in a chair by her brother's bed, finally drawing a sun in her sketchbook instead of the shadowy figures she used to scribble. The bureaucratic and emotional battle had been devastating, but the result was right there, in the slightly less labored breath of a small boy, in the steady drip of the medication that was giving him a chance at a future. As he watched the scene through the glass of the room's door, Arthur felt a profound sense of peace. He was no longer the man who had stalked a little girl through the darkness, driven by suspicion and anger. His transformation was complete. The redemption he'd found wasn't in preserving his wealth, but in using it. Over the next few weeks, he visited the hospital every day. He read stories to Peter, helped Lena with her homework, and talked with Helena, not as an employer, but as a friend. Slowly, a new dynamic began to form, not based on employment or gratitude, but on genuine affection. The mansion, once a silent mausoleum, had now become a base of operations for Peter's recovery, a true home. He had risked his fortune, but in the process, he had found something infinitely more valuable: a family. 6 weeks after that fateful night when suspicion had guided him through the dark streets, Arthur Sterling's mansion was an unrecognizable place. Not in its physical structure, the marble remained polished and the crystal gleamed, but in its essence, the oppressive silence had been replaced by the most precious sound Arthur had ever heard. Lena's laughter echoing through the corridors as she chased a ball, and the excited murmurs of Peter, who, though still recovering, could now sit up in bed and play with his new toy cars. The house, once a cold vault for a lonely man and his wealth, had become a home, pulsating with life and hope. Peter's treatment was a slow but steady success. Each day brought a little more color back to his face, a little more strength to his limbs. The doctors were optimistic, predicting a near full recovery. Arthur wasn't content just to pay for the treatment. He dove in, studying the boy's condition, consulting with specialists, and establishing a small foundation to fund research into rare diseases, ensuring other families wouldn't have to endure the same desperation. His business, once the center of his universe, now took a back seat. He discovered that the real profit wasn't in the dividends of his stocks, but in the grateful shine in Helena's eyes and the spontaneous hug Lena gave him every morning. One sunny autumn afternoon, Arthur gathered Helena, Lena, and Peter in the living room. He had spent the last few weeks with lawyers, not to protect his assets, but to build a new framework for their lives. With a gentle seriousness, he explained to Helena that he had begun the legal process of becoming the official guardian for both Lena and Peter. It wasn't an act of charity, he stressed, but a request. He needed them as much as they had needed him. He offered them not just financial security, but a last name, a family, a future of opportunities that he himself had never had the chance to share with anyone. Helena, whose tears were now only of joy, accepted without hesitation. The mansion that had echoed with cold loneliness now pulsed with the warmth of a newly formed family. The empty hallways where Arthur had walked alone became raceways for toys and stages for impromptu plays. The precarious shack where Lena had delivered food now stood empty, a silent symbol of a journey overcome, while its former residents lived with dignity and love in the very house that had witnessed the beginning of it all. Lena, the girl who had fled in the dead of night carrying stolen food, discovered that the most desperate acts of love can reveal the humanity hidden in the coldest of hearts. Peter, the boy who had been on the verge of being lost, learned that miracles happen through the courage of sisters who never give up and the compassion of strangers who become fathers. Arthur, the millionaire, who had lived trapped in his fortress of emotional coldness, understood that true wealth isn't found in shielding oneself from attachments, but in the courage to open one's heart to those who desperately need help. And Helena, the mother who had feared losing everything by hiding the truth, discovered that vulnerable honesty can awaken compassion where once there was only indifference. That evening, Arthur stood in the old security room, but the screens were dark. He looked out the window at the garden, where Lena and an increasingly strong Peter were trying to teach each other how to ride a bike under Helena's watchful eye. He smiled, a genuine, deep smile. He finally understood that in following that little fugitive into the darkness, he wasn't just uncovering her secret. He was, at long last, finding his own way home.